Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've got an update on the potential of Alberta seceding from Canada and joining the United States. From everything I've read, this would be an extremely complicated process that would very likely take a minimum of like 3 or 4 years. Of course, the wild card in all of this is Donald Trump in the United States and how powerful we are. Would we try and fast track this? We know Trump's talked about the Panama Canal and Greenland, along with Canada in general, possibly annexing it more as a joke, people surmise, although this Alberta situation is a little bit different. He still hasn't talked specifically about Alberta separation, but this article, it's very interesting. They talk about how Carney's going to approach Alberta and their concerns when it comes to the regulation that is placed on their resources, specifically oil, and how, Alberta possibly joining the United States would financially make a lot more sense. This article also talked about, as I looked through it, how before this election, there was only around a 30% approval on the idea of Alberta seceding. And there's a number of factors that go into play when it comes to Alberta leaving. Would they have some type of deal with the United States? I'm guessing they would. My guess is this would all be negotiated before they even left, or it would be put kind of in place before they left. Because if you are Albertans, you do have to have some worry about, well, if we become independent, we're not a very strong country in terms of militarily, along with just the fact that they'd be extremely small in terms of their population. You also have the idea of possibly Saskatchewan joining Alberta. Maybe that would make it easier. Would Alberta have a referendum and then Saskatchewan have their referendum? And would there have to be more things that happen outside of Carney winning? Because you see Carney go out and he's trying to unite everyone to a degree, especially considering this wasn't a landslide at all. Carney won, and a lot of people in the United States said, wow, that's pathetic that the Liberal won considering Trudeau stepped down. Poilievre had such a huge lead coming into 2025. They called the election about a month after Carney got in. They did like 2 weeks of rallies, and then Carney wins, but it was minority. If you look at the age separation, it was really because of the boomers. The younger people in Canada voted more conservative. So it's not like there's this huge yearning for liberalism within Canada. You could say, well, the conservatives are more moderate in America's terms. Yes, they are. But it's interesting when you look at this article saying that Carney talking about uniting the country, but possibly being too anti-oil, saying that he will reject an east-west pipeline as unnecessary in his post-fossil fuel world. Carney's a huge globalist. He ran the Bank of England, and he is someone that's extremely liberal when it comes to climate change and making the world more green. Of course, if you're a Canadian, it's got to be infuriating, especially if you're Alberta, considering the population, the CO2 emissions relative to other countries, including the United States, by the way. You know, we deal with this with China and stuff, and how they always, they demonize Western countries when you compare it to India and China, especially China and their CO2 emissions. But with Canada, it's got to be like 100 times worse in terms of how low their CO2 emissions are in comparison to the United States and Canada and China. And you're telling us we have to cut back and regulate it? He will place a tax on oil exports to raise money to subsidize manufacturers in Ontario and Quebec that are hit hard by Trump's tariffs. If those things happen, the separation movement might gain significant support. So we could be looking at maybe a few months before a referendum. I'm not sure they have support. We're going to have to see the polls in terms of it before you could argue, well, maybe it was around 30%. It's going to be higher than that because there's more momentum with Carney winning. But maybe Carney's rhetoric on being anti-oil, being pro-regulation, that might also help sway some people. And I think a lot of these people are saying, well, if we become independent of Canada, where does that leave us in terms of our power? They would very likely need to have a relationship in place, whether it's joining the US or if they're going to be independent. There's going to have to be some clear tie-in with the United States. That would be my guess in terms of that. Now, when it comes to a potential map, I had somebody make this for me. This is also, disregard the bottom 48 U.S. states, because this is actually, I believe this is 51 states maybe, because there's some states split up here, maybe like 52. But either way, when you look at Canada as a whole, right now we're really just talking about Alberta. So you can see the surrounding provinces, the surrounding territories, Alberta, and I would agree with this coloring. Some people wouldn't, but I would say Alberta is more conservative, similar to an Ohio. You can see this around the same color. Iowa, +8, +10 conservative. That's what I would say. Texas, Florida, somewhere in that range. And what it would be is it would be Alberta first. So you would take Alberta. It would look extremely weird on a map. Absolutely. But if you take Alberta, maybe Saskatchewan comes. Not saying it's going to happen, but Saskatchewan also, if you look at the, just in general, in the 2025 Canadian election, very, very conservative relative to Canada's standards. Now, in the United States sense, they would be seen as slightly lean conservative, more of a swing state though, maybe comparable to a Michigan, compared more so to maybe to the Rust Belt in terms of that. And then you've got Manitoba. I haven't heard much about Manitoba joining. They're probably a little bit more liberal. BC would be more out of necessity if you wanted to connect Alaska. And see, you can connect Alaska to the lower 48 through BC because of this area that we have here. I mean, that's area that we've owned since we bought Alaska in 1867 from the Russian Empire. It's not like we just took that area, but I mean, you could hypothetically connect it there, but you'd also probably want Yukon logistically as well to make it a seamless connection, because I've heard a lot of this is mountainous. It's hard to get through. You put a highway system there. But whether or not BC is liberal. BC is very comparable to Washington and Oregon. I mean, this map has them slightly less liberal than Washington and Oregon. I don't mind the size of Washington and Oregon. They're bigger states, but this is just a hypothetical thing. But look, BC would be something that would happen if you really wanted all of Western Canada, and you could honestly just take take Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, Northwest Territories, Yukon, leave Nunavut. Although you would also want Nunavut, honestly, or you could just expand the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan higher. I mean, you could also do that. The thing that makes this very unique, and this is why I really want the United States to acquire Greenland. You know, this says one electoral vote. Greenland would not have any electoral votes in a U.S. election for a long time. It could be an Alaska situation to where very little population, because of the climate, more Republican people move up there. They've got 57,000 people now. Maybe in 20 years, they end up getting 3 electoral votes, and they might lean conservative if that ended up happening. I mean, Greenland would also be... I think Trump is probably going to have to, I don't want to say risk anything with Greenland, but there's going to have to be like some type of push, I think, unless they can really just bribe all of the politicians within Greenland, which honestly probably should happen. Like the officials, the government officials within Greenland, and then they can kind of create the narrative that the United States should buy Greenland. But that's another story for another day. There might have to be some type of aggressive push from Trump, which people would not like, but if it's necessary to acquire Greenland, Greenland is just a perfect situation in terms of territorial acquisition. It's insane for like the United States, especially considering they're not fully independent. They're owned by Denmark. Denmark themselves is a smaller country. They can't defend Greenland. They can't extract any of the rare earths and the minerals. And also, the most important thing is 57,000 people. And that's why these territories also would be interesting for the United States as well. Extremely low populated areas. So you're not dealing with a bunch of people uprising against you if you acquire these territories. It's all, a lot of it's uninhabitable land. You have one major city in Yukon, which is Whitehorse, and then you have Yellowknife and Northwest Territories. Outside of that, these are not populated areas. And Greenland, it's all along the coast. The center of Greenland is a glacier. And we're talking about maybe glacier melt and there being more minerals available within the next 30 or 40 years. That's why, if you're Trump, it's a legacy play. But in general, let's just get back to this. You look at possibly acquiring Alberta, then maybe Saskatchewan has a referendum after Alberta. The problem right now is if they had a referendum tomorrow, I don't think they would have the numbers. The question is, what does Carney do to maybe anger Albertans even more when it comes to his stance, his extremely liberal stance on climate change, which is very impactful to Alberta because of the amount of natural gas and oil they have. And then if you see, this is the issue. This is the problem. If you take Alberta and let's say Saskatchewan joins, that's not terrible, right? And they're both territories, and this is like a 4 or 5 year period, anyways. It's not like, oh, they're going to be voting in 2032 or anything like that. It would be a longer time, I would guess, because it takes like years to apply and be granted a statehood within the United States. So you take those two. Do you consider taking BC, even though it's liberal? You want to connect Alaska to the lower 48. You take BC. You take the territories up here. The issue becomes you're going to deal with it. Don't pay attention to this. This is a mock thing, but you've got Ontario, Quebec. These provinces on the eastern side are like feeders, because what is Canada at that point? You would guess that a liberal, if they got into the White House, would say, well, we need to add all of these: Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, Ontario, and that's the issue. That's why you want it. But the thing is I almost think it would be such a slow process. It might be worth it anyways to try. It's not like, oh, you're going to add Alberta and Saskatchewan. It's going to be done in a year, and then all of Canada is going to join in the next 5 or 6 years. These things take a long time to come to fruition if it happens. So if you add Alberta within the next 3 or 4 years, you're going to have energy independence. And by the way, the unique thing with adding Alberta, immediately, we're really not going to see. Well, it's hard to say, because when you add territory, especially a significant amount of territory on North America, it'd be an extremely unique thing. You are gaining power, and you're gaining more of a northern presence. So that's a positive in and of itself, outside of all the resources. But with the way we do trade, initially it would be a net negative if we added Alberta. Now, long term, it would be a huge positive. It's kind of like acquiring Greenland. We're going to have to pay a decent amount, we would think, unless Trump just invades it, to acquire Greenland. And there's going to have to be a big upfront investment within Greenland in terms of their upgrading their mining capability. And it's going to cost a lot of money. And when it comes to Alberta, their trade with us, the dynamics of it, initially it would be a negative, but eventually it would be a huge positive in terms of energy production within the United States being cheaper, and having Alberta and having a northern presence. I mean, owning more territory is really a priceless thing. And I'm not saying promoting, oh, we should add all this and globalism and all that. Well, that's why I wanted only Greenland, because there's 57,000 people. There's nothing globalist about 57,000 people. It's such a unique situation. And by the way, Greenland it's owned by another country. With Alberta, they would be voting in a referendum to leave. Now, I don't think they have the votes right now. That's why I'm saying and referencing this article, well, maybe if Carney's extremely liberal like we expect, with oil policy and with regulations, that would anger people within Alberta even more, and they could say, all right, that's it, we're done. The problem is, I think, with the people in Alberta, there's so much unknown when it comes to separation from Canada. And the unknown is scary to humans. So that's why I say there might have to already be a deal in place before they even vote. Like, not in place, but like a hypothetical deal that Trump says, you can join us, we're going to give you X, Y, and Z. I mean, a lot of it has to be worked out in terms of the healthcare and other things, the taxes. You could try and talk to the people of Alberta and calm them, because there is a lot of unknown when you talk about just straight up leaving Canada. And the Canadian government is not going to like this, obviously, with how much Alberta produces and how much money they give to the eastern provinces and subsidies. So there's a lot at play when it comes to it. I don't really think they have the votes right now. I could be wrong. But if it's around 30% that said they might consider leaving, I mean, what is it now? 40%? You're going to have to get well over 50%. Well, I don't know about well over, but you're going to have to get like 55%, I think, to really make noise in terms of a referendum. Maybe if Carney is very, very liberal, you could see that. Maybe if he backs off of it. I mean, you might get some type of negotiations with Ottawa in terms of possibly being able to produce more oil, deregulating, things like that, by making noise about secession. That could be another leverage play. It's just like the whole idea of Greenland and Denmark doing their own thing with the United States, to where they're playing. I mean, the dynamic of that is so weird, because Greenland wants to be independent of Denmark, but Denmark is saying, well, the United States, we're the big, bad, evil people. you shouldn't even control Greenland. But honestly, it's like Greenland gets money from Denmark, so I don't even know what Greenland is talking about. Like they want to be independent from Denmark. Denmark makes up 25% of your GDP, so I'm not. I mean, how does that dynamic work? But they want to have a relationship with China, which, and by the way, there's been things that have been talked about within China and Greenland possibly coming together, which honestly should just allow Donald Trump to take over the island if that happens. And NATO should like that, by the way. The United States controlling Greenland's a lot better than China having influence in Greenland. But that's another story for another day. The point of it is it would be Alberta, then Saskatchewan. But the problem is if Alberta only gets 55% in a referendum, that would be enough to really kickstart things. But I don't think it'd be enough because Saskatchewan is less conservative than Alberta. I'm not sure that would be enough in Saskatchewan. I don't know. I'm not sure what the dynamics are in Saskatchewan exactly in terms of the separation. All we hear about is Alberta possibly seceding. And then it's like, well, do you want all of Western Canada? Would you take BC? BC is very liberal. Their coast is really liberal. The more you get inland, it's rural area, it's conservative. It's the similar dynamics with Washington and Oregon. There's very conservative giant swaths of land in Washington state and Oregon. There's giant conservative areas in California. So it's just the coastal area is what's extremely liberal. So, but you would take BC, you'd be able to connect the lower 48 to Alaska. And then, I mean, could you imagine? You're talking about, imagine just taking Nunavut. I mean, if you take Nunavut and you've already got Alaska, you've got Greenland, you've got full control of the Davis Strait, of Baffin Bay, of the Hudson Bay, access to the Hudson Bay, even without Manitoba or Ontario. You would still have Nunavut, so you'd have clear access. And then the Northwest Passage as well, you'd have full access to that. And you'd have all this Arctic control as well, the control of the Arctic Ocean from above North America. So there's a lot to this. And that's why I've made videos about Trump having an Arctic empire, which would include the territories. These are the territories, very, very sparsely populated because of the climate. I mean, most of Canada, they all live very, very south. And that's why they're talking about like they're doubling their population by 2100. It's like a new century project. It is, but honestly, because of how sparse their population is so sparse and the declining birth rates, they're in a horrible position. Canada is horrible. I mean, we are too, and then we do it by supplementing it with immigrants, which is not the way to go. But with them, it's like they have such a small population. You add foreigners, they've already destroyed a lot of their culture within the bigger cities, and that's happened in the United States as well. But with them, it's like 10 times 10 because they already have a low population, like a very, very low population. But what I'm saying is like all of these waterways, it's full control. It's such a unique thing to where there's just such limited territory up here. How would you go about acquiring these areas though if you're Trump? I mean, Greenland we've talked about for a while and it seems like a pretty straight shot. Well, I mean, there's negotiations, but a lot of it is just buying off their public officials. That's what I think it is. And then they will, and it's also bribing the citizens. That's what it is. I mean, that's what you have to do now. Or you just land onto Greenland and you secure the island. They don't have a military. What are they going to do about it? What is NATO going to do about it? But then it becomes this big thing to where they sanction us and stuff. Do we want to deal with that over Greenland? But you know, a lot of these European countries need to get punched in the face. I'm not saying go to war with them. I'm just saying in general, like if we take it, what are they really going to do outside of posturing? I don't think they're going to do anything. Really, you want the United States to leave NATO? Seriously? By the way, we're supplying Ukraine now and helping Ukraine get more stable footing in a peace negotiation against Russia because of that minerals deal. So NATO the European countries should love that we're going to give Ukraine more negotiating leverage because of the minerals deal. We're giving them Patriot missile defense systems. But listen, this has gone off the rails. What I would say about this is, look, we'll see what happens with Alberta. My question is, if they have a referendum, I don't think they're going to have the votes right now. But if Carney's extremely liberal, like people say he is, and he's this horrible globalist, he's obsessed with the threat of climate change, yet nobody talks about the East and India and China and all the pollution in the waters by Vietnam and other countries. This is some serious stuff. Alberta's going to be very angry about this if something happens to where there's even more regulatory policies infringed onto Alberta. And so that's really what we have to watch for. But if Alberta happens, I mean, we would be happy with just Alberta. You know, I'd be a bit annoyed, though, because the map of the United States becomes a bit of an issue. That's why you'd want all of Western Canada. The map looks better. But you'd also take Nunavut and you take Manitoba. Now you've just completely cut them even more so in half. We've got all this territory up here that's going to become more and more valuable as time goes on. And it's all the waterways. But guys, that's just going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.